So first, I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's Garden Chat presentation. For those who don't know me, my name is Marlene Smith, and I'm the president of Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay. Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay is deeply rooted in natives, serving Charles, Calvert, St. Mary's, Anne Arundel, and Prince George's County. And before we begin our presentation, I'd like to introduce you a little more to Wild Ones for those who aren't familiar with us. So Wild Ones is a national 501c3 charitable organization based in Wisconsin that works to connect people and native plants for a healthy planet. There are currently 98 chapters and 37 seedlings across the United States. If you're not a Wild Ones member, I encourage you to join your local chapter. In Maryland, there are 5 chapters, including Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay, Wild Ones Delmarva on the Eastern Shore, Wild Ones Greater Baltimore, Wild Ones Greater Frederick, and Wild Ones Nation's Capital Region. Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay currently has 96 members, which includes 3 businesses and 3 nonprofits. And this chart shows the distribution of our membership, with the darker the color, the heaviest concentration of members. The mission of Wild Ones is to promote native landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. Our vision is native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community. Through a variety of educational programs and resources, Wild Ones shares the simple message that a healthy planet starts with native plants. Wild Ones focuses on promoting native plant palettes and regenerative landscaping practices that preserve and nurture the variety of life in the world around us. Wild Ones is the only national organization advocating for landscaping with native plants. Wild Ones inspires change through shared core values, including respect and inclusivity for all. We share evidence-based information to fuel our action and growth. Tonight's guest speaker is Madeline Potter. Maddie is a faculty specialist in entomology and integrated pest management with the University of Maryland Extension Home and Garden Information Center. In her role, Maddie educates the public and provides training to UME faculty and staff on insect conservation, sustainable pest management, and related topics. She also serves as the faculty lead for the Maryland Master Gardener Pollinators subprogram. Prior to her current position, Maddie was Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator and Horticulture Educator for UME in Howard County, Maryland, where she managed a team of over 170 volunteers and led numerous presentations, workshops, and outreach programs, reaching thousands of community members. She holds a BS in Sustainable Horticulture and an MS in Entomology, both from the University of Maryland College Park. With over 6 years of experience in outreach and education, Maddie has also conducted research to support sustainable management strategies for invasive insect species. She is currently developing statewide resources and tools to support pollinator habitat certifications, recognition programs, and educational initiatives. A key goal of her work is to increase public awareness of Maryland's diverse pollinator species, which includes bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths, and their varied habitat needs. She is committed to creating inclusive, learner-centered educational experiences that connect people with science-based knowledge and empower them to take action for pollinator conservation. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and welcome Maddie to share her screen for tonight's presentation.
Amazing. Thank you, Marlene, for that introduction.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay for inviting me to speak to you all tonight. We have a lot of really great content we're going to get through, and if you ever have a question that pops into your mind throughout the presentation, feel free to put it in the Q&A feature down below in your Zoom box, and we can be sure to address those at the end. So as Marlene said, I'm a part of the University of Maryland Extension. And if you've never heard of the Extension program before, there is an Extension institution in every state that's a part of the land grant university. So University of Maryland is one of our land grant universities here in the state of Maryland. And our role as Extension is to extend information that we learn at institutions like the University of Maryland out to the public to benefit people's lives. And so I'm a part of a program called Environment and Natural Resources, but we have programs in other areas such as 4-H with is youth programming. We have family and consumer sciences, as well as agriculture and food systems. So a lot of free programming and resources that are accessible to Marylanders. So please check us out if you haven't looked at our University of Maryland Extension webpage before. And I'll be sure to link at the end of today's presentation and point out to you all that we have a lot of resources related to gardening, pollinators, sustainable pest management, on our University of Maryland Extension web pages, just about any topic you could think of. So as I'm with the university, we always have our program assurance statement to post, letting you know that our programs are available to everyone, regardless of your age, your race, your color, your sex, your gender, and so on. And so if you ever have any questions or concerns in terms of the accessibility of any of our programs, you are welcome to reach out to any of us at Extension, or we also have contacts from our federal funders with the USDA that are listed on this poster. So here is an outline of the topics that we will go through tonight, the first of which is partners in pollination, native plants, and their insect allies. Then we'll talk about why insects matter and highlighting the critical roles they play within our green spaces, our ecosystems. We'll then talk about insects under pressure and the challenges that they're facing in a changing world, especially with the impacts of climate change. And then last but not least, we'll finish off with grow the change, creating insect-friendly gardens and communities. So let's begin with the partners in pollination. And so when I'm speaking about supporting our native wildlife, our native insects and pollinators, it's really important to talk about native plants because it starts from the ground up, right? We have to have healthy soil so we can grow native plants. Our native plants support our native wildlife. And there's lots of different definitions around what a native plant is. One definition that I have up on the screen now is a plant that has evolved naturally in a specific region or ecosystem over a long period of time. And this is a key part of all of the definitions over a long period of time. And this is because it has long relationships that is developed with the wildlife. So our native wildlife and our native plants have co-evolved over long periods of time. And so they've learned each other, basically. They have beneficial relationships. Pollinators, for instance, have evolved to best utilize the nectar resources from our native plants. We'll also talk about how we even have specialists. So specialist pollinators, so they specialize on a specific species of native plants or grouping of native plants. And so they have even tighter relationships there and better mechanisms to transfer pollen and collect nectar. And so when we're looking at our native plant communities, we can see that they support a lot of our native pollinators and insects, like our white oaks, supporting a lot of our different native caterpillars, like our orange-striped oakworm we can see on our left, or our different red maples, supporting different pollinators through nectar, and things like our common milkweed supporting not only our monarchs, but our other butterfly species as well. And I might be preaching to the choir here, but highlighting why it's important to plant more native plants, especially if we are speaking to gardeners, community gardens that are looking to add and incorporate new plants. There's a lot of people in the general public that still don't understand the difference between a native and a non-native plant and the importance in that distinction. Of course, non-native plants play a role within our ecosystems and can sometimes fill gaps and even bloom periods that when our native plants are absent. but really starting to boost the importance of our natives, right? They are luckily growing in awareness, and we even have a new native plant specialist here with Extension that is unique to Maryland and unique to the entire United States, which is amazing. And so some things we can focus on are highlighting how our native plants are supporting local wildlife. They're adapted to local conditions. They reduce water and chemical use, so other inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. They reduce invasive species issues, improve soil health, and overall can boost ecosystem resilience. And I like this graphic to show the different connections that our native plants can have with different insects and the roles that insects play. So classic one that we may know about is our pollinators, right? They help to move pollen between the different plants to help with plant reproduction, and in turn they gain nutrition from the nectar. We have other things like our decomposing insects, like some of our beetles that are helping to break down decaying organic matter like fallen logs and decaying wood. And so they have that form of nutrition from the decaying wood, for instance, and then they're also returning that organic matter down into the soil to help further support our plant communities. Our insects are also really important sources of food for other animals, like our birds, for instance. A lot of our native birds rely on native caterpillars as one of their main sources of food. And so walking through what pollination is, we may know this already, but I always like to go through why are pollinators important? Well, they're really important in terms of the reproduction of our plants. And if we're talking about native plants, especially in the reproduction of our native plant communities. And so with our pollinators, it could be a bee, it could even be a beetle. We have beetle pollinators or flies. They're coming across a flowering plant, typically seeking out that nectar. Sometimes they're feeding on the pollen grains themselves, maybe even some of the foliage along with it. And while they're feeding, they're getting their nutrition, they get some of the pollen grains on their body from the male anthers of our flowers, so the male parts. And they move in between plants. If they come across another plant of the same species, maybe they're dropping off that pollen and it reaches the stigma or the female reproductive part of the flower, and then enabling fertilization and further down the line seed production of future plants. We call this cross-pollination. So a lot of our native plant species rely on some form of animal or insect-mediated pollination. Of course, we have other forms. We have self-pollination. We have wind-pollinated plants as well. But really highlighting the role of our different animal pollinators, leading to the reproduction of our different plant communities. Now, another thing that pollination can help with is climate resiliency in terms of increasing the genetic diversity within our plant communities. So with climate change, our plants are facing numerous stressors, and it's really important to have that genetic diversity in place. So we have our different plant communities, right? We want them to be genetically diverse. So one individual or a couple individuals will survive different stressors. So they have genetic diversity. One might be better at managing drought stress than the other, and the one that survives will be able to reproduce more of that particular species. And so when we have this high genetic diversity within a plant community, we have higher adaptive capacity, we have the potential for long-term survival and higher resilience. And this is going to become more and more important as we see further effects of climate change. When we have communities with low genetic diversity, we have low adaptive capacity, weak potential for long-term survival, and low resilience. So our pollinators can help with this in terms of moving that genetic material around between the different communities. Now, as you can imagine, if we have different communities siloed, where we have this more with urbanization, more hardscapes being put in. We have the different green spaces, different potential plant communities being separated. And so that's potentially where we're seeing more isolation of different plant species and communities and potentially lower genetic diversity. So our insects, if they have the ability to transfer that pollen, the genetic material over broad landscapes, we can help to boost the climate resiliency of our different native plant communities. And so this all comes to green space connectivity. As I mentioned on our screen, we have a little diagram of the different managed scapes that we might have throughout our area, whether we're in Maryland or outside of Maryland. No matter if we're in a city or a more rural area, we have these hardscapes, right? Roads, we have our different buildings, our homes that begin to kind of disconnect our larger green spaces, our more conservation areas. But luckily, we can make a difference no matter the size of our outdoor space that we're working with, even if it's a porch or a balcony. If we add in sources of nectar and fuel for our pollinators, that helps to boost green space connectivity, allowing them to travel between these different green spaces. Again, helping to boost the genetic diversity of our different plant communities. Here's just one example of kind of identifying our different larger green spaces within our own county. So this is a map of green spaces in Howard County, where my office is based out of. We can see the green patches are some of our bigger green spaces, maybe potentially some of our conservation sites. And so we can see there's a lot of space in between for potential of pollinator gardens. We can call them way stations or pit stops, where we can add in our own wildlife habitat to help them along their way. Which leads us into why insects matter and the other critical roles they play within our ecosystems besides pollination and supporting our plant communities. So as I mentioned before, we have our decomposers. I see a lot of best beetles, also commonly known as patent leather beetles out there. They're big decomposers of fallen logs. Something to look out for if you're on a hike or a walk. A lot of our insects are nutrient cyclers in some form. One great example is a lot of our aquatic insects, so ones that live in our different water body systems. Their immature stages might be aquatic, say like our dragonflies. Their immature stage is aquatic, adult stage is flying terrestrials. But in that aquatic stage, and while they're in the water, they're feeding on detritus. So maybe pieces of fallen leaves that have fallen into the water, and they help to break them down and recycle those nutrients. There's a lot of pest controlling insects, so things that are predators or parasitoids or parasitic. So they help to manage our pest populations naturally. And then sources of food like our birds and many other wildlife species. So I like to point out that insects are everywhere within our garden. They're not just staying in our distinct pollinator garden that we might make with a bunch of flowering wildflowers, right? They're everywhere. And we might be familiar with this if we're an avid gardener trying to grow different vegetables and herbs. We might come across some pests, for instance. And so there are a lot of areas where insects are living. There's so many different species that we have here in Maryland, and they are covering lots of different niches and spaces where they're living. So we could have butterflies in our pollinator garden, decomposers in any fallen wood that we have. We can even have predatory rove beetles along our turf feeding on other insects. We could have herbivores like our pesky flea beetles within our radishes or eggplants. And in our flowering shrubs, we might have parasitic wasps that are helping to control different pest populations. So it's important to recognize that they're all over our green spaces and learning to recognize some of our common beneficial insects, distinguishing them from some of our common pest insects, and keeping these things, these insect communities in mind when we're doing any sort of management before we apply any sort of pest control, whether that be pesticides or something more sustainable like insect netting, for instance. And so, as we've talked about with our role of pollination, helping to transfer pollen between flowers, enabling plant reproduction, boosting biodiversity, genetic diversity, and is a huge part of why we have the food we eat, right? Pollination of a lot of our produce. 80% of the world's flowering plants rely on pollinators to reproduce. So as I mentioned, we have other forms of pollination, wind pollination, even water pollination for some of our plant species, but 80% of them, approximately that amount, rely on our animal pollinators. Approximately 35% of the world's food crops rely on pollinators to reproduce. So some food we see on our screen here rely on insect pollinators like coffee, chocolate, almonds, strawberries, apples, potatoes, you name it. And this might surprise you, but 25 to 50% of flower visits in agricultural ecosystems are by non-bee insect pollinators. So the pollinator we see on our screen now, I believe that is an apple blossom, is a syrphid fly, also commonly known as a hoverfly. So we have lots of different species of syrphid flies here in Maryland. A lot of them look just like a bee in terms of a black and yellow coloration, but they're really important fly pollinators. So let's meet some of our other insect pollinators. So with our bees, a lot of people think of our honeybee that comes in a lot of our pop culture, right? But our honeybee is non-native to our area. And we have a lot of native bee species, over 400 native bee species here in Maryland. And a majority of them actually nest in the ground. So they don't nest in our stereotypical honeycomb hive like we think of with our social honeybees. A lot of them are solitary and ground nesting. And so on our screen, we can see what some of the ground nests can look like from above. Looks like a little soil mound called a tumuli. And they come out at various times of years. Typically, a lot of the species are emerging or provisioning their nests in early spring. So it's important to recognize that we have ground nesting bees, and important to recognize that they are not aggressive and they do not defend their nests. So we may have a bad experience with a ground nesting yellow jacket wasp, but that is completely different. Our native ground nesting bees are not going to sting us unless you squish them against your body or step on them. Another portion of our native bee species use pre-existing holes, tunnels, and shelters to nest in. So this could be things like pithy, hollow, woody stems. It could even be hollowed out flower, herbaceous flower stems, or an abandoned bird house. And we may have even seen mason bees that use tunnels in wood. Maybe we've seen people who've purchased those tubes of cardboard for these particular cavity nesting bees. So pretty unique, and they can use a variety of different resources too. If we know about our leaf cutter bee that create those little circular cutouts, especially from eastern redbud leaves, they use these circular cutouts to create little chambers in different cavities and openings, could be in wood or flower stems, and that's where she'll lay her egg, add in some food, and that's where her young will be raised. So a lot of really unique stories there. When we're creating our pollinator gardens, supporting beneficial insects, it's important to highlight the difference between our generalists versus our specialists. They have different dietary needs. So we have generalist pollinators that can use a wide range of plant species for food, whether that be nectar for the adults, or pollen or foliage for the immature stages. Our specialists rely on maybe just one species of plant or a small collection of plants to finish off their life stages to support their nutrition. And so keeping these specialists in mind, because if they don't have their host plants present, they can't successfully reproduce and go through their different life stages. So some examples of some specialist pollinators are on our left, we have our violet miner bee, which relies on different violet species So they collect pollen, and her young will only feed on pollen from these particular groups of violet plants. Our spring beauty mining bee only uses two plant species to collect pollen from to feed her young. So the adult bee will nectar on various flowering plants, but her baby bees only feed on pollen from either the Virginia Spring Beauty or the Carolina Spring Beauty. It can have a really characteristic, pretty pink pollen to it. And then we may know of our zebra swallowtail. The caterpillar only feeds on foliage from our native pawpaws, or things like our spicebush swallowtail, which use things like sassafras or northern spicebush. Next, we have our decomposers to help with nutrient cycling, waste reduction, soil aeration, and food web support. So think about all the waste and decaying material we would have out there if we didn't have our decomposers, like our decomposing insects. Our predators, these are our unsung heroes in our gardens that help to manage pest populations. A lot of them are unfortunately targeted intentionally or unintentionally by different pest control measures. So they aren't allowed to do their natural pest control. So we have different predatory insects like our ladybugs, also known as ladybird beetles. Both the adult and immature stage are predatory, feeding on things like aphids. We also have the immature stage of lacewing. Lacewing larvae are very vicious predators, helping to feed on pests. Then on our top, we have one of our assassin bug species. One of our true bugs uses that straw-like mouth part to feed on different insects. Our parasitoids, another great form of sustainable pest control, also known as biological control. So they're laying their eggs either on the inside or the outside of a host, feeding on that host, potentially killing it down the line, and reproducing more of these natural enemies, as we call them. So classic example on our top right, we have a tomato hornworm. We may have wondered what the heck those little white things are hanging off. We may have mistaken those for insect eggs, but these are actually the pupal cases of a parasitic wasp called a braconid wasp. A really tiny wasp. She's out there looking for a host to lay eggs in a tomato hornworm. They're going to feed on the hemolymph or the blood of the caterpillar, eventually push their way out of the caterpillar skin. They're going to meticulously spin their own silken cocoon until they finish off their development and emerge, popped open the top of that silk cocoon, almost like a trapdoor, and we have a new parasitic wasp. So very cool, awesome form of biological control. Now, our herbivores, commonly known as more of our pest insects, right? They play really important roles in terms of supporting our predators and our parasitoids. If they aren't present at a certain amount, we're not going to have that pest control services, and we'll potentially further down the line have a what we call a secondary pest outbreak, where we have even more herbivores than before. So understanding their role, supporting our herbivores like our caterpillars, for instance, who will eventually turn into key pollinators like our butterflies and our moths. Now, we talked about all these different roles that insects can play, and our insects don't neatly fall into one role. They likely play multiple roles and serve different ecosystem services, as we call them. And one of my favorite examples of this is a yellow jacket. So a yellow jacket might be aggressive and be a pest to us, but in natural systems, they play lots of roles where they are preying on other insects for us, they are helping with pollination, and they are also a source of food for other predatory insects, like we can see with our robber fly here feeding on a yellow jacket wasp. So it all depends on the context. We can't simply label one insect as always a pest and one insect as always some form of a beneficial species, right? Always depends on the context, the goals of the spaces that we're talking about, and so on. And then some other examples, a lot of our pollinators are also a predator or parasitoid. So we can call these our superbugs, right? They're contributing to pollination and also natural pest control. So some species that have these dual roles, we can see on the screen, like our flower flies, hoverflies, like we saw earlier, as a key fly pollinator. We have goldenrod soldier beetles, and another example is our blue-winged wasp on the right. So next we'll get into insects under pressure and challenges in a changing world. So according to the research, we could lose up to 80% biomass of important insect pollinator taxa if we continue on the track we are on now. And so just thinking about this, 80% of the biomass of just important pollinator insect taxa, not even including our decomposing insects or our predatory and parasitic ones, all the other different types of insects that are valuable to our ecosystems. And one of my favorite graphics in terms of showing the different stressors that our insects are facing is shown on the right from a publication in 2021 titled Death by a Thousand Cuts, Global Threats to Insects. And so all around, we can see different visual drawings of what these stressors are, as well as labeled text. So things like pollution, introduced species, insecticides, droughts, fires, storm intensity. So it's not just one thing that's leading to insect or biodiversity decline, it's the culmination of many different things that they are facing. Two of the top things that are posing a threat to particularly our pollinators are things like pesticide use and habitat loss. And when we're talking about pesticide use, we also don't want to forget all the other chemical inputs that are potentially being used in managed spaces, things like fungicides and herbicides, because no matter the chemical, it could have a potential impact on our pollinators, whether that be indirectly or directly. So this particular research figure shown on the screen here shows some of those indirect and direct relationships between our pollinators in things like herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. So even thinking about herbicides, for example, down at the bottom of this graphic highlighted in green, herbicides potentially impacting vegetation, not only our weeds, but potentially other pollinator host plants, and that leading to the reduction of loss of floral diversity and food resources for our pollinators. So being mindful of any sort of inputs, chemicals that we are using. There are lots of different ways that pollinators can be exposed to pesticides or insecticides, whether that be direct contact on the pollinator itself, could be residue left over. So if someone came and sprayed a flowering plant, pollinator came later, got some of the pesticides on their body, could impact them that way. Could be contaminated nesting material. As I mentioned with our leaf cutter bee, if we had pesticides on that leaf that the mother bee was going to cut out and take that leaf material to create a little nesting chamber for her young, the pesticide residues on that leaf could impact her and could impact her future immature baby bees. We could also be spraying in our landscape and impacting ground nesting bees. So a majority of our native bee species are ground nesting. So if we're spraying our turf or our lawn to manage other insect pests, depending on the product, could be harming our native bee species. One very unfortunate example of the impact of pesticides on our pollinators is this recorded mass killing of bumblebees that resulted from the use of systemic pesticides on 55 linden trees. And so without getting into too much detail about systemics versus contact pesticides, a systemic product is one that is applied to a particular plant, say a tree, in some form could be a root drench or trunk injection, and a systemic can move through all parts of the plant. So even if it was applied to the roots, it can move up into the foliage and potentially into the nectar. And so when we use systemic products, these are particularly can be harmful to our pollinators. And we can see with this particular neonicotinoid, dinotefrin that was applied, it resulted in the death of over 50,000 bumblebees. And I mention this especially when it comes to the craze around spotted lanternfly because systemics are being recommended for the management of spotted lanternfly. We really need to carefully consider our options as us at University of Maryland Extension do not recommend pesticides as a management tactic for spotted lanternfly in home and community landscapes because of these potential results that can happen. And for the state of Maryland, we do have a Pollinator Protection Act of 2016, which is neonicotinoids cannot be applied outdoors by home gardeners in Maryland. You have to either be a farmer or a certified pesticide applicator. So we legally can't apply products like neonicotinoids to our landscapes ourselves. But if we are to hire a pest professional or landscaper and we're asking them for pest management options, oops, I don't know why it's going forward on its own, they could recommend something like a systemic. So always knowing your options, you can always use credible resources to look up the products they're recommending and the potential impacts. And you can also always reach out to us through our Ask Extension services, submit your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. We also have record of the loss of butterfly diversity. So for every 5 butterflies we saw 20 years ago, today we are only seeing 4. So between 2000 and 2020, total butterfly abundance fell by 22% across the 554 recorded species that were looked at. And quoted from this publication, insecticides have been identified as the leading causes of butterfly declines in recent analyses in the Midwestern US and California. So just in these 2 areas for these particular sightings, but we also have a lot of potential declines happening here in the Eastern United States as well. Another impact through changes in climate is phenological mismatches. So phenology is the timing of biological events, like the timing of when a plant blooms or when a bee emerges from where they are spending the winter time. So with a lot of our ground nesting native bee species, they are overwintering or spending the winter months underground and waiting for the right cues to let them know it's time to emerge come spring. So it depends on the species, but for example here, say this native plant or this particular native bee species that's ground nesting uses the cue of temperature to know when to emerge. But maybe the host plant that they utilize uses day length to let that plant know it's time to bloom. And so we could have mismatches here where we have changes in temperature and changes of day length where these might not align. So we may have a pollinator emerging before our host plant is blooming, or vice versa. We may have our plant blooming and going through its bloom period before our pollinator has emerged. And so with this, we potentially have a lack of pollination and a lack of nutrition sources for our pollinators. And so we have evidence of this phenological mismatches happening. This particular study was done in Costa Rica, but is an alarming example where they found pollinators emerging 17 to 38 days earlier than the flowering of their main host plant species. So something to really be cognizant of and be aware. We're going to talk about how we can mitigate the effects of phenological mismatches in our yard coming up next. So growing the change and creating our insect-friendly gardens and communities. And so we've learned about some of our insect stories, right? What they need to reproduce, what they need to nest or overwinter in. And so keeping these things in mind when we're creating our pollinator or our insect habitats, providing sources of shelter, nesting habitat, nectar, pollen, and even having some of those prey and host insect species. We can contribute to our green space connectivity no matter the size of the space that we are working with. The graphic we see here is we have four key components of creating a pollinator habitat or beneficial insect habitat. So today we're going to go into detail with incorporating a diversity of native plants and then leading off into leaving bare ground patches and plant stems. So when we're talking about incorporating a diversity of native plant species, we want to talk about species diversity as well as structural diversity. So what structural diversity means is that we're not only planting herbaceous flowers or wildflowers, but we're also including grasses, sedges, ground covers, vines, shrubs, trees. So we have this structural diversity in place, example of which we can see on our screen here. This is one of the pollinator gardens down at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., in its full glory, where we can see various forms of plants. And they're creating the structural diversity, and that leads to the creation of different microhabitats. And so with the diversity of pollinators and beneficial insects and their diverse needs, if we create this structural diversity and species diversity, we're creating a buffet, a plethora of resources to support a diversity of insects. Another example of this, someone's front yard. Depends on our HOA, right? What's allowed, but this is a really cool example of structural diversity, species diversity. And highlighting that we don't want to forget about plants like our native grasses and sedges, because these can be really important host plants for our pollinators. So two examples of this. On our left, we have one of our native butterfly species, which unfortunately has been seen declining in numbers, our northern pearly-eye, and it uses various woodland grasses, including our bottlebrush grass. And then on our right, we have one of our skipper species, the dun skipper, which uses various sedges. Talking about regionality. So we have ecoregions throughout Maryland, a diversity of ecoregions. And these are areas where ecosystems, type, quality, and quantity of environmental resources are generally similar. We'll talk about how that plays into plant choice in a minute. And then we also have plant hardiness zones based on average annual extreme minimum winter temperature to determine where perennial plants are likely to thrive. And so when we take a look at our Maryland and District of Columbia USDA plant hardiness zone map, we can locate where we are, where our gardens are, and locate that plant hardiness zone with a number followed by a lowercase letter. And when we have this information, we're going to select further plants that we might want to add to our gardens. This can be really helpful for selecting perennial plants. So ensuring that they're going to survive the cold extremes of our area. And so most plant nurseries with the plant tag will have on their hardiness USDA zones that are appropriate for that particular perennial plant species. And so knowing your hardiness zone is a starting place for choosing the right plant for the right place so it can thrive. Talking about ecoregion. So if you look up, there's different ecoregion maps of Maryland, just for curiosity's sake. There are different levels to it, can get a little confusing, but what can be really helpful is there's a lot of resources out there where you can type in your zip code, it'll look up your ecoregion for you, and then further produce recommended plant lists based off of your ecoregion. And so this is going to help to narrow down different traits about your particular ecosystem and what particular plants will thrive there. Because even just in the state of Maryland, we have lots of different habitats, soil types, you name it. So this ecoregion can really help us narrow it down for what plants will thrive. And so one resource is through pollinators.org, which has a way to look up your ecoregion and produces a corresponding recommended plant list. We also have Homegrown National Park. They have ecoregion plant lists, And I'm highlighting here, they have one on container gardening keystone plants, which I think is really unique and awesome for some of our smaller green spaces. Some broader scale science-based plant lists, one's from the Xerces Society, where they have one for the Mid-Atlantic region. Great place to start in terms of narrowing down our plant lists. And then there is the Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping for the Chesapeake Bay area. If you aren't familiar with this resource, I highly recommend you check it out. If you can't get a hold of a print copy, there is a free PDF version online linked here through the Department of Natural Resources. Really great list of different native plants for our area, including checking out those native grasses and sedges. Now, if we're looking for pollinator-friendly native plants that we can start to incorporate at this time of year, these are just a couple of examples. There's lots of different plants that we can begin to incorporate, but I wanted to mention ones like our narrow-leaved mountain mint, our hairy beard tongue, and Culver's root. So always planting the right plant for the right place, right? Getting to know our space, how much light it receives, how moist the soil is, and what type of space that we're working with in terms of height. Are we okay with our plants getting really tall, or do we need them to stay more on the shorter side? So a lot of these things we can look up through credible resources or on that particular plant tag. Some other ones we have here are cardinal flower. A lot of our native goldenrod species are important as a late blooming plant to provide food for our late season pollinators. And things like our asters, like our whitewood aster. And a couple different options for container-friendly pollinator plants. And if you have any recommendations yourself for container-friendly pollinator plants, I would love more recommendations. We're doing a little experiment outside our office here with different native pollinator plants in containers and see what does best. Now, there are some plants that we do want to avoid when we're talking about pollinator spaces and creating insect habitat, and one of which is double bloom hybrid flowers. So these have been ornamentally created because they do look interesting, right? We can see on our far right, we have a double bloom coneflower on the top, and then a typical coneflower on our bottom right. And so what we have is extra blooms where the seed head typically is. So this looks really interesting, right? Especially to a consumer who's in a garden center looking for something eye-catching. But based on the current research, these double bloom hybrid flowers typically have less nectar and pollen because of these extra petals. They're often replacing the reproductive parts and reducing food sources. They're typically harder to access for our pollinators. With these dense petals, it can block bees and butterflies and other pollinators from reaching that nectar. And overall, showing a lot of lower ecological value, so compared to our straight species and naturally occurring varieties. So when we can, we want to prioritize our straight species or naturally occurring varieties over these modified cultivars. If you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to me or also your local Master Gardener program. Other plants to avoid is tropical milkweed. So milkweed is a really important and vital host plant for our monarch caterpillars, right? They only feed on milkweed foliage, but we have a lot of native milkweed species. This is a non-native milkweed species, tropical milkweed. Also very eye-catching, which is why I'm seeing it pop up in different gardens. I've seen it down in DC in a couple of areas. But it does not naturally die back in the winter time like our native milkweed does. And this is really important in terms of managing the presence of a monarch butterfly parasite. So because this particular species doesn't die back, it can further harbor this parasite and further infect future monarch butterflies. And this parasite has been linked to lower migration success, reductions in body mass, lifespan, mating success, and flightability. And our monarchs are already dealing with a lot of stressors and declines already, so we don't want to make it worse by planting and potentially harboring this parasite. So if we're looking for a native alternative, We have other different species, but one that looks similar in terms of coloration is our butterfly weed. We want to make sure we're identifying and managing invasive plants, particularly invasive bush honeysuckles. They pop up just about everywhere. I see them along the sides of highways. I see them around my neighborhood. They are very fragrant. They smell really great, right? And they can be attractive to our different pollinators, but they compete with our native plants and they are potentially harming our native plant communities. And so knowing what our different invasive honeysuckles are, we can use different identification resources. Things like the Seek iNaturalist app can be a great place to start. And with our own managed spaces where we're allowed to remove plant material, we can begin to replace these invasives with some native alternatives like our trumpet honeysuckle, our red chokeberry, and our black chokeberry. Now, speaking of fragrant and attractive plants, butterfly bush is an invasive plant, and a lot of people don't like to hear this because they love their butterfly bush. It is highly attractive to our different pollinators, but this isn't always a good thing, right? Because it is a non-native invasive, it outcompetes our native plant communities. And if we have our pollinators reinforcing its reproduction, that's going to take away from the reproduction of our other native plants. And so there's some research to show that butterfly bush is distracting or stealing our native pollinators away from our different native plants. And butterfly bush itself has no native butterfly caterpillars that can use this plant as a resource. And so we want to make sure we manage this. Maybe further down the line, if we have butterfly bush, we think about replacing it with a native alternative, things like Virginia sweet spire, sweet pepper bush, blazing star, or New York ironweed. Talked about regionality. Now we'll talk about phenology. So this ties into that phenological mismatch we talked about, where we have our bloom time and the emergence of our pollinators potentially not aligning. And so we can help mitigate this by having season-long bloom within our landscapes during our growing season. So from early spring through late fall, always having something blooming in our landscape to provide that food source for our pollinators. And so we can take an inventory of the plants we have in our landscape and use different plant lists to look up their bloom periods. We can do this throughout the seasons where we kind of just visually take note. It's early spring next year and we see what's blooming. And maybe by late fall, we don't have something blooming in our landscape. That's a great cue to let us know I need to add some late blooming plant to my landscape to help support the pollinators. And a lot of the science-based plant lists out there will have a column on bloom period. Of course, this is always changing as we have changes in our climate, but having that essential range, right, early or late season bloomer can be really helpful. And we'll talk about design and making sure we're planting the right plant for the right place in terms of sun, soil, and water conditions, getting creative with our space. If we haven't thought about maybe vertical plantings with some of our blooming vines, we can think of container beds, mini meadows, sidewalk edges, and more. And knowing it's okay to start small. A lot of our native plants, especially if we're purchasing them from different native plant nurseries, can get quite expensive. Luckily, there are a lot of native plant shares and seed shares to help boost the native plant accessibility within our different communities. But knowing we can just start by adding one new native pollinator plant to our landscape and seeing how it goes and moving from there. If we are looking for design help, there are some really great design templates that we can get inspiration from. These are from the Live Green Howard website. Particularly, there is a Bee City group, which is a Xerces Society group based here in Howard County. And they have design templates for every sun and soil combination or condition you can think of. And this can be a really helpful starting point. So whether we have a sunny and dry spot, sunny and moist, they have a design template for you. There's some interesting research that came out in terms of designing for monarch butterflies. So showing that monarchs will use even small monarch or milkweed gardens. They tend to avoid hiding avoid the hiding milkweed. So we want to make them very prominent in our gardens, finding that they will find them easier if we plant the milkweeds on the perimeters of our garden spaces. So easy access. We also tend to want them to have the milkweed in isolated stands, make it really easy to identify. Usually we're telling to add a diversity of plants together, right? Creating that structural diversity. But we're finding with this particular research that was done that isolated tall stands of milkweed make it easier for our monarchs to find them. And just some design inspiration of all different unique spaces that can have some of our pollinator plants. And then we'll lead off into our next factor of creating a pollinator haven, which is leaving bare ground patches and plant stems. So as we've learned, a majority of our native bee species nest in the ground. And so recognizing that they're losing a lot of their habitat and we want to conserve them and leave them be where we can. They're not aggressive, they don't defend their nests. They are solitary, so we just have one female digging and provisioning one underground nest, which can have multiple chambers where she's laying eggs. And their activity period is usually pretty short, where we have the flying female collecting pollen to bring back to create pollen balls or food for her babies and laying those eggs. And once she's done with that flight period, her baby bees are going to develop underground and typically won't emerge again until the following spring. So temporary nuisance potentially if we don't like those flying bees over our lawn. And so we could even designate certain areas where we leave them be. They tend to like bare or patchy turf or grass or different areas. So if we want to deter them sustainably, we want to increase the vegetated area and reduce the amount of exposed soil. Plant stems. So this is a great time of year to leave your plant stems. If we're pruning at various heights. So we're creating cavities in different nesting sites for our overwintering insects. A lot of our native bees will nest inside these different cavities. We'll spend the winter months there until the following spring. And so the general recommendation is to wait as long as possible into spring, even early summer, before we start pruning or doing our garden cleanup, because we have a lot of overwintering insects in our fall winter plant debris. And if we do need to prune or clean up, maybe we collect those prune clippings, collect the fallen leaves, place them in another area of our yard so we can allow whatever might still be there, those insects can still successfully emerge. Another example of, I believe these are some dried Joe Pye weed, might look unsightly to some eyes, but can add a lot of texture and some interesting colors to the landscape and is a great form of habitat for our insects all winter long. Fallen logs, another great opportunity for a lot of our native bees and other insects. Rock piles can be really great habitat as well. There's some ground nesting bees that will prefer rock piles in between bare patches of soil or ground. Lots of great cavities and crevices to nest amongst. And then fallen leaf litter, especially this time of year, we want to leave the leaves where we can. There's a lot of native butterflies and moths, queen bumblebees that will use leaf litter to survive the winter months. And so here on our screen, we have a repeating clip of a newly mated bumblebee queen These are the ones to survive the winter, so the colony dies off. This newly mated queen will find a patch of soil. She'll dig into the soil, and that's will she'll remain all winter until it's time to emerge in the springtime. And so the leaf litter layer is really important to help mitigate the extreme temperatures for her to survive. So I won't go into detail into our two other factors, but also very important, especially during our hot times of the year, to add a shallow, clean water source. Our insects need water too. And then very, very important to reduce or even eliminate our pesticide use because a lot of pesticides, no matter the type, are negatively impacting our different insect communities. So as we end off here is just some examples of things that we can add to our own garden spaces. And so things like increasing our plant diversity, remembering both species and structural diversity, not forgetting those native grasses and sedges, planting those where we can. Planting milkweed on the edges of our garden, typically in more isolated tall stands, making it really easy for our monarchs to find them. Incorporating companion plants, so flowering plants among our vegetables and herbs is going to attract our predators and our parasitoids to help control those pests. Leaving ground nesting bees alone, planting native bunch grasses, adding clean sources of shallow water. So these are just some examples. So let's talk about some key takeaways. We went through a lot of information today. Today's webinar will also be recorded so you can view it at a later time. And you are always welcome to reach out to me at any point after today with questions too. So key takeaways. The first is to identify an insect before considering it a pest. There are many different insect pollinators and other beneficial insects in our outdoor spaces. And we do not expect you to become an insect ID expert. We have thousands of insect species here in Maryland. Luckily, we have a lot of resources, a lot of upcoming apps that can be a great starting point, right? And you can always send us photos through Ask Extension to ID as well. But recognizing that that insect that's on our plant might be one of our beneficial insects. Creating pollinator havens of any size supports habitat and green space connectivity, supporting biodiversity and climate resilience. Native plants provide many benefits to our pollinators in local ecosystems as they have co-evolved with local wildlife and are adapted to local environmental conditions. Increasing native plant diversity can support pollinator diversity by providing a diversity of resources for pollen generalists and specialists. Leaving non-disease plant debris like our plant stems, leaf litter, and fallen logs can provide critical pollinator nesting habitat, especially at this time of year as we're getting into the colder season. Reduce or eliminate pesticides by utilizing more sustainable pest control options. And if you are new to this concept of integrated pest management or sustainable pest control, we have a lot of really great resources through the University of Maryland Extension website. So things like using insect netting on our vegetable plants to exclude pests instead of maybe applying a chemical product. And last but not least, it's important to know that you can make a difference. People ask me all the time if my small pollinator garden is really going to help our pollinator community, and it really does. There's a lot of really interesting research that's emerged with even really small urban spaces that have a diversity of native plant species, supports a diversity of pollinators. So you can make a difference no matter where you are located in Maryland, the different habitat you're working with, or the space that you are working with. So to have as a takeaway, I would love to take a moment for you to brainstorm what you could do as a mini pollinator action plan within your own outdoor space, whether you have your own garden or you work in a community garden. Imagining what that green space looks like right now, whether you have a garden, a balcony, a patio, container bed, and then we're going to ask ourselves these three questions. The first of which is, what is one feature your space already has that could help pollinators? So you can think of it now, you can go out in your space tomorrow throughout the day and begin to recognize maybe some old plant stems we can leave in place or bare patches of soil. Maybe we had ground nesting bees during the spring or summer. Now we're recognizing that we might want to conserve them, leave them alone. They're not going to aggressively sting us. Maybe we have milkweed, fallen logs, potted herbs, which we can let flower at certain times to provide nectar. So thinking about things we already have that we can intentionally conserve. The second question is, what is one change you could make this season to support pollinators? So this fall season, maybe we're used to raking up all our leaves and removing them, sending them off to waste management for pickup. But maybe there's somewhere in our garden where we can leave the leaves be in a thin layer, or maybe we compost them, we put them in a compost pile. Third is, what is one barrier you may need to overcome and how? So thinking about maybe you want to add more native plants to your landscape, but you might not know where you can purchase native plants. And so identifying what that barrier might be is one step further to overcoming it, right? If we don't know where native plants are, we have a Maryland Native Plants Program webpage, which has a list of native plant nursery sellers throughout the state. So we can connect you with that resource. So with that, I do have a list of resources. We can make sure that you have access to these links here. You can see them in the recorded version of this webinar as well. But I highly recommend checking out our University of Maryland Extension Yard and Garden resources. We have a multitude of pages on various gardening topics. We have the Pollinator Partnership website, pollinator.org is a really great resource to check out. Associated Society for Invertebrate Conservation, also the Maryland Native Plant Society. And if you're interested in doing participatory science, it can be as easy as snapping a photo and uploading it to the project website. Very valuable data through things like iNaturalist. And then there's specific ones like Bumblebee Watch, Project Ground Nesting Bee, Firefly Atlas, and more. We'll leave us off with a final key message, which is a diversity of native plants can support a diversity of pollinators. On the presentation screen now, we have a QR code from Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay for a short 2-question feedback survey.
I'd like to remind them that you will be taking some questions and answers, and we'll also remind them of upcoming events that Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay has where we'll be distributing free native plants.
Awesome, sounds good.
So don't leave too early, folks, if you can give us a few more minutes. Yeah, let's go over the Q&A first. And I think you may have answered this in the presentation. The first question that came up was, I sink logs, like when people have their trees trimmed, and stack the pieces curbside for firewood into the soil as aesthetic barriers between the lawn and my gardens. Does this help the soil? Does anyone else do this? I'm gardening to restore microfauna as well as plants. And I do the same thing, and I have found that I get bees using them and other decomposers, but I'll let you speak to that a little more.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. Yeah, I think it depends on the type of wood, how long it'll take to decompose, and what other decomposers are utilizing it, but definitely a great thing to do. I like this idea.
And then another question is, what does the pollinator do during that time before the host plant is ready? What does it mean for the insect and the plant?
It's going to depend on the situation, but you can imagine if we have a specialist pollinator that only relies on that one plant species or a small collection of that plant species, it could really impact their nutrition and their reproduction. So a lot of our specialist bees, for instance, like we learned, the adult can nectar on various flowers, so she might be getting nectar resources, but she might not be able to find the pollen that her immature baby bees are going to need. So that could delay things. It could impact the production of new native bee species. Um, but it's all really going to depend on the situation. It could be uh, impacting them a little bit or impacting them a lot. We could see changes and going to depend on the plant community around them.
Okay, and then we've got one, how far must logs be from one's house to keep termites away?
That is a great question. I don't think there is a magical number, or I shouldn't say magical, but like a distinct distance that I can recommend. All I can say is it's just really important to monitor for signs of termites. We have a really great termite University of Maryland Extension webpage on this. If you have particular questions, you can reach out to us through Ask Extension. Um, I would say it's really important to note that termites are a natural part of our landscapes, right? And just because we have a termite colony nearby doesn't guarantee that they're going to infest your house. So it's just about monitoring, being mindful. It is up to you if you want to do preventative measures with a professional pest control company. But it's hard to know exactly if that log is going to harbor termites. And even if it does, it doesn't guarantee they're going to come into your house.
Okay, let's see. We've also got a couple questions in the chat. Let's see. Um, Patricia, if you're still on, did you want to ask your question? You want to unmute and ask Maddie your question?
Hi, this is Patricia. My neighbor, I don't have the problem in my lawn, but my neighbor sometimes lets the grass in their yard get a little bit higher than probably should. And over time, it's happened more than 1 year. He has yellow jackets, and when he's mowing, they come out and they sting him. Like he runs, runs in the house and everything. So I feel for them, and I don't know what to say to them except maybe keep their yard cut shorter. Not sure.
Yeah, with yellow jackets, a lot of them are ground nesting and they use pre-existing tunnels and burrows. So they don't dig their own nests underground. And so if there was an abandoned animal burrow of some kind, they could utilize that as a nesting site. I don't believe the height of the grass is really going to influence whether the yellow jackets are there or not. It just could hide them. So they could be nesting there early in the season, be hidden by the grass. They don't know they're there, and then they go to mow, and then they're like, "Whoo, there's the yellow jackets," because they build up in numbers. Their colony size gets larger as we go through the seasons. So they're at their peak typically later in the summer. And this fall season is when the colony starts to break down, their social structure starts to break down. And so the wasps are typically out on their own. They can be a little bit more aggressive because they're seeking scarce food resources before they naturally die out as it gets colder. So they might be a little bit more aggressive this time of year.
I see. So there's not a whole lot he can really do. It's just already burrows that are existing. There's not a lot you can do about it, actually.
Yeah, if you are able to identify where their nest is, you can there's different commercial wasp sprays, or you can hire a professional pest controller. Otherwise, what you can do is wait for them to naturally die off as the first frost comes around.
I think that I've seen them pour detergent like water, like big 5-gallon bucket of water with suds and just sort of soak it in that area. I think they've had some success doing that.
Yeah, we don't recommend home remedies through extension, but everyone can make their own decisions. But we do want to be mindful that we shouldn't just be mixing concoctions. We can't guarantee that that's going to provide effective control, essentially, because it's not science tested or based. But yeah, some people do that. Mhm. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
And there was some conversation going on in the chat about HOAs and the height of plants in the front yard.
Mm-hmm.
I guess somebody has mentioned that their HOA has a rule of less than 12 inches. Um, Teresa, are you still on? Did you want to um, talk about that any further? Are you in Maryland? Because Maryland does have legislation that prohibits HOAs from um, restricting people from having native gardens.
It only applies to the front yard of her house.
Hmm.
So I looked it up while we were talking, and you can contest that, but you might have to take it to court. So there's apparently still they can't tell you what to grow, but they can tell you how high things can be. It's kind of one of those iffy things in the law.
Hmm.
And Crystal has her hand up. So, Crystal, if you're still there, unmute and you can ask your question.
Oh, okay. I just finished typing it in the Q&A section. I have an active yellow jacket nest underneath our porch as well, and they only stung me once, and that's because I was working nearby it. And ever since then, leave it alone. So if they die during the winter naturally, will they come back to that same nest next year? If so, how can I prevent or how can I prepare the area throughout the winter so they do not come back?
Great question. So they don't reuse old nests. So depending on kind of their nesting site that they chose, if there's kind of remaining nest material, they're not going to come back and reuse that nesting material. They're going to create a brand new colony next spring with the overwintering queens. But I would, after they die off, like deep in winter, when you don't see any activity left over, what I would do is check out the area they were nesting and see if there is an abandoned animal burrow or what type of cavity they may have found habitable for them, and see if there's something that could be filled in. There could be rocks or plants that could be added that could deter them from that area. And if you have any questions about this while you're kind of exploring it, you're welcome to send us photos of that area through our free Ask Extension form, and we can help you kind of brainstorm some ways to deter them.
The only other question I see, which hasn't been answered, is someone asked where can they see the presentation again? So tonight's presentation was recorded, and after editing the Zoom files, it will be available on the Ones Chesapeake Bay YouTube channel. After it's edited, it will also go to Maddie for her review before we actually make it public. But so keep your eye out. If you're not following us on social media, that's typically where we announce when these things are available. We can also see about sending those who attended an email when it's available. And if Maddie has any documents she'd like to share, we can get those distributed too. And I did put a link in the chat for our upcoming events. We have multiple events coming up all over the Southern Maryland region where free plants will be available. So please check out our events page on our website. I think you'll be glad you did, at least if you can make it to one. But there are several from now through, I think, October 24th. We have multiple ones that we're hosting directly or that we are promoting from perhaps one of our members doing something under another hat that they wear. So please check us out, and we'd love to meet you and see you at our events. And that's all I have, unless anyone else has any questions. Maddie, this was a wonderful presentation tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for attending, everyone. And feel free to reach out to me at any point with questions and to connect with us through Extension.